For the very first time, people with Alzheimer's and their families have some hope. There's more than 6 million people in the United States living with Alzheimer's. By 2050, the number of people 65 and older could be as high as 13 million. Scientists have struggled to understand what's the cause of a disease versus what are the symptoms of a disease like Alzheimer's. But the fight against Alzheimer's was catapulted into a new phase after the FDA fully approved a drug manufactured by Biogen and Eisai called Leqembi, which slows the progression of the disease. This is a really big deal because there's still no cure, and the Alzheimer's community is still healing from the controversy surrounding an earlier drug promising the same thing. But before we go any further, it's important you understand the science. The way to tell if someone has Alzheimer's is if their brain has high amounts of two proteins, beta-amyloid and tau. Both cause brain cell damage, but it's still unclear if high levels of these proteins cause Alzheimer's or if they're symptoms of the disease, until now. But we'll get to that later. Families affected by Alzheimer's naturally get their hopes up when they see headlines flood their feeds about a new FDA-approved drug. And in theory, the move to expand Leqembi and its availability should now move pretty quickly. But the reality is, the rollout will likely take longer than patients and their families would like. In 2021, the FDA approved the first drug for the treatment of Alzheimer's that could slow down the progression of the disease. It received approval for widespread use, even though its two big trials had contradictory results. Medicare refused to cover Aduhelm because there wasn't enough proof of its efficacy, and public trust in Biogen's ability to deliver an effective Alzheimer's drug took a hit. But now that Biogen and Eisai's newest drug, Leqembi, has received FDA approval, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are treating this drug a little differently. This class of drugs is what I should say, because really they're treating any drug that works in the same way as Leqembi or Aduhelm before it to clear away amyloid plaques. I think really what they're doing is trying to make sure that the right people are getting this drug in the safest possible way, but patients have been waiting a really long time for something. And so any barriers to access are controversial. The FDA is the governing body. They approve our drugs. They make sure that they're safe and effective, and they say, okay, it's fair for a company to sell this drug. But then after that, an insurance company needs to decide that it's going to pay for the drug. And so what's happening with Leqembi is that public insurance body for people who are largely retired, 65 and up, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they're the ones who are sort of saying, hold on, we're not sure if this drug is effective and safe in the way and is going to have as big of an impact for the costs to the healthcare system. The first challenge is identifying the right patients. To be eligible, people need to be in the early stages of the disease and have confirmation that they even have Alzheimer's and not some other form of dementia. That requires a special PET scan that detects amyloid or a lumbar puncture to analyze the cerebral spinal fluid. And get this, Medicare will only pay for Leqembi and any similar drugs that eventually receive approval if data is collected on the drug's efficacy and safety in the real world, rather than in the highly regimented setting of a clinical trial. That's going to make it difficult to roll them out in an equitable way because, in order to get the drug paid for, you need to be registered in a registry essentially, so they can track health outcomes. Having a drug that actually treats the underlying cause of the disease and not the symptoms really changes the whole paradigm of how neurologists treat their patients now. And so to add in this new layer that is also having to track their patients' performance essentially on this drug is complicated and kind of onerous for physicians. So what now? A new study has given us some great insight about other players that may be involved in Alzheimer's. As technology makes it easier to winnow those players out, scientists should step up the search for alternate or even complementary approaches to diagnosing and treating Alzheimer's. One research team found a collection of proteins that appeared perturbed in midlife in the people who go on to develop Alzheimer's disease 15 or even 25 years down the road. Many of those proteins were not directly involved with amyloid and tau, but instead were involved with immune processes, communication between nerve cells, and protein regulation. So far, data suggests that Leqembi can ease the decline in people with mild forms of the disease by around 30%. In order to get beyond that 30% benchmark, the field needs to put more energy into identifying and testing less obvious actors contributing to the disease. We can learn about this without having to fund all new studies or follow people for 10 to 20 years to understand the results. An incredibly rich data set of over 15,000 people for a long-term study of atherosclerosis or a buildup of plaque in the arteries already exists. The study began in the mid-1980s, collecting information from nearly 15,800 people between the ages of 45 and 64. Those people are still being followed today. By 2010, as people in that group started hitting their 70s and 80s, researchers added a new set of testing focused on people who had gotten dementia. In the decade since they started following these folks, technology has raced ahead. Researchers can now go back to those early samples and in a cost-effective, reliable way take inventory of thousands of proteins contained within each person's plasma to ask if any were associated with the risk of Alzheimer's later in life. The researchers at the National Institute on Aging have already discovered a list of a few dozen proteins that were more prominently expressed in people who went on to develop the disease. But one, called GDF15, rose above the crowd. That protein seemed to be involved with regulating certain kinds of inflammation, and although it had previously been linked to Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases, further digging showed that while it's a predictor of disease, it's not a driver of disease. The researchers hypothesized that it's likely an anti-inflammatory molecule that's kicking into action in response to some damage, a process that's happening as early as someone's 40s. That adds to a growing body of evidence from genetic studies pointing to the immune system's role in the disease, long before plaques can be seen in a brain scan. To be clear, these findings aren't an early test for Alzheimer's risk. They don't even clearly identify a target for new drugs. But by flagging these proteins, the study could help scientists better understand the very early processes that set some people on a path towards dementia. The arrival of the first drug that can slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease and all the ones that come after it is important. It's not a cure though, which means that this is just the beginning, it's not the end. Scientists need to keep unraveling and understanding why this disease starts in the first place. That'll lead us to better tests, better drugs, and ultimately a cure. I hope that day comes soon. If your family is affected by Alzheimer's, I'm sure you feel the same. And let us know how you're feeling about this first drug and what it means to your family.